And I want to start off just by saluting y'all for putting forward what seems to be a clear and consistent political line in times which have proven quite disorienting for much of the left. Now, I'm basing this on social media. So, but what I gather from what Firebrand's been putting out has been really strong. Support for liberation from the river to the sea by any means necessary, unconditional solidarity with the Palestinian national struggle, and placing blame for all the violence in historic Palestine squarely where it belongs, with the Zionist entity and the decades of settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid that have gotten us here. So since we share a good deal of our understanding of the struggle in Palestine right now, I'm going to try to avoid preaching to the choir and speak more to the dynamics of the Palestine solidarity movement here in the United States, which I think, I might have some insight to contribute, but I'd be remiss, I think, not to start by saying at least a few words about the recent attack on my piece that folks read for tonight by Dan Labatz and Stephen Shalom. If folks haven't read the response, I recommend it. I find it to be an exceptionally transparent demonstration of the stakes of the debate that have come up around Palestine since October 7th. Any number of socialists have accommodated to the groundswell of Zionist propaganda and tried to find some dishonest way of reconciling a generally held politics of liberation by any means necessary with a condemnation of Palestinian militancy. But Labatz and Shalom are quite clear. They call by any means necessary, quote, old leftist language that should be retired from our liberatory lexicon. Likewise, any number of socialists have, tried to muddy the waters of a settler colonial analysis of the state of Israel, uncomfortable with the political conclusions that such an analysis requires. But Labatz and Shalom are clear. They mock me for calling Israelis settlers, and themselves use this term descendants of settlers, as though settler colonialism is only a historical event, not an ongoing set of social relations governing the extraction of surplus value on nearly half the planet. In other words, what is at stake in the left's orientation on Al-Aqsa flood is not an isolated question of strategy in one particular conflict. What is at stake is the whole edifice of socialist anti-colonialism. I'm happy for us to discuss and debate the appropriate socialist analysis of Hamas or the role of armed struggle in Palestine or any number of strategic and tactical questions. And if we're going to do so, we ought to engage our Palestinian comrades directly in that discussion and in debate and push ourselves to understand why, for example, the entire Palestinian left in the occupied territories has embraced the united front with Hamas and overwhelmingly supports the operation of October 7th. The fact that two white U.S. academics attempt no such engagement with the Palestinian left, but rather cherry-pick misleading statistics to draw patently false conclusions about Palestinian public opinion should clue us in. They're not interested in a serious, grounded assessment of the situation with our Palestinian comrades. They're instead using strategic questions to obscure a rollback of much more serious theoretical and political advances in the socialist movement. And this brings me to the first real takeaway that I hope folks will engage with tonight. We are currently involved in debates on dozens of different questions, big and small, about different political actors, different strategies, and different points of analysis. But motivating these debates are at least two fundamentally different visions of socialism. And I think it's important that we keep this in mind. There's a socialism that sees working class interests as being in conflict with the diverse interests of exploited and oppressed people of all stripes. And there's a socialism which sees working class organization as precisely the vehicle for the expression of all the liberatory impulses of all the wretched of the earth. Labatz and Shalom try to differentiate support for Palestinian resistance from any other case of militant liberatory struggle, saying, quote, these were not enslaved people breaking their chains and fleeing north. I think this is nonsense. The questions of principle raised by October 7th are no different from the questions raised by Nat Turner's rebellion, nor the Boxer Rebellion, the Mau Mau Rebellion, the violent resistance of Jewish partisans in Eastern Europe. There have always been socialists for whom questions of particularist liberation confront the process of human liberation as competitors. But our tradition, I think the genuine socialist tradition, sees in every intifada, every shaking off of the oppressor by the oppressed, the seeds of a freer world. Now, I'll guess that most of us have heard the quote from Eugene V. Debs, while there's a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. I think that socialists need that kind of gut level identification with the Palestinian kids breaking out of a concentration camp and fighting back against their oppressors. And I think when we lose that, we lose the very heart of our political project. So that's sort of where I stand, and sort of responding to some of the debates that have come up in the last couple of days. But like I said at the top, I do want to focus most of what I'm going to say tonight on sort of an assessment and analysis of the movement for justice in Palestine here in the United States, because I think it's a complex conjuncture that we find ourselves in. We have a lot of comrades here in the room who I want to be discussing this with. On the one hand, this movement has had historic, unprecedented success in sustaining large, high-intensity actions in solidarity with Palestine over the last couple of months. But political developments within the movement, I think, have been more contradictory. And now, having fought for a month and a half for a ceasefire, which we kind of got and may be expiring like in a couple of hours now, it's highly uncertain what level of activity and toward what ends the movement will be able to sustain going forward. And I want to talk about how we got here so that we can, assess how we get past this impasse. And I want to start that assessment with by discussing the Bowman affair, which is, if folks aren't aware, this is a controversy that sort of embroiled the Democratic Socialists of America in the last couple of months of 2021. Very briefly, the Representative Jamal Bowman, who is a DSA member and an elected representative in Congress, he voted in support of U.S. funding for the Israeli Iron Dome defense system, and then subsequently went on this big, essentially Hasbara, Zionist propaganda junket, did a whole photo op with Naftali Bennett. It was a whole thing, and this led Palestinians and their comrades in DSA to call for the expulsion of Jamal Bowman from the organization. But instead of doing that, the DSA's NPC, their national committee, the National Political Committee, unilaterally decharted the working group and banned the working group's leadership from taking leadership in the National of DSA. Now, this led to this huge outpouring of resentment and anger within the organization. Dozens of different chapters passed resolutions condemning the NPC's actions and eventually forced them to overturn them. But we're still feeling the effects of this today. I mean, I say we. I'm not actually a member of DSA anymore. I was, but even earlier this year, as I talked about in one of the articles that was in the reading for tonight, the impacts of this crisis are still very much with the organization. And I think it demonstrated some things about the organization which are worth noting. For one, my opinion, based on the organizing that I did within DSA, is that the number of avowed Zionists within the organization was actually always underestimated by virtually all parties to the debate. As many people here know, the DSA was historically a labor Zionist organization. And while many Zionists left in 2017, when the convention passed the resolution in support of the BDS movement, many of them didn't, and were a significant part of the pushback to the working group throughout this crisis. We've seen some of their resignation letters in the last couple of weeks being published all over the place. But this wasn't the major source of pushback for the working group. The major source was the hegemonic electoralism within DSA. There was a widespread sense that the working group, in making big principled statements of support for Palestinian struggle, for defending the right of Palestinians to resist by any means necessary, were endangering relationships that DSA held with elected officials, certainly endangering the relationship with Jamal Bowman, pushing for expulsion. And what we see over I'm not going to summarize the whole article, but suffice it to say, I think that we can actually see that this electoralism within the group is actually related to many of the broad problems that DSA as an organization has struggled with in regards to racism and social chauvinism within the group. But I actually don't want to talk I think the more interesting dynamics to discuss from the Bowman affair aren't actually the ones within DSA, but are the ways in which the movement itself, sort of outside of DSA, responded to the developments within the organization. The side that everybody saw, play out in public was that a number of organizations within our lifetimes, the National Students for Justice in Palestine, Palestinian Youth Movement, released a big statement saying that they would refuse to work with DSA until the working group was reinstated. But the missing piece of that is that a number of organizations were actually also applying pressure the other way, trying to stop the working group from raising its criticisms of Bowman, trying to stop the push for expulsion. And these contradictory pulls on the forces within DSA represent, I think, two divergent strategies responding to two different assessments of BDS. And I think that it's worthwhile for us to actually treat these seriously and investigate them, because I think they're still really live. We see them in the movement today. For the camp who was pushing against expulsion, the success of BDS in changing public opinion and enabling the election of Palestine sympathetic electeds represented the conditions of possibility for an immediate electoral route to U.S. sanctions on the state of Israel. And, potentially bringing about, potentially they saw that kind of power as capable of bringing about a fundamental transformation of the relations of power within historic Palestine. Now, it's not necessarily that they gave up the need for a Palestinian revolution, but they saw the crumbling of Zionist hegemony in the U.S. and rushed to maximize that for all its electoral and policy worth. Meanwhile, the more, what I would describe as the more radical camp, the Palestinian youth camp, I guess, in the U.S., had a different analysis. They didn't actually think that U.S. imperialism could dispense with Zionism at this point, and saw the only mechanism for bringing about a real fundamental confrontation with U.S. empire's policy in historic Palestine as a mass rebellion in the U.S. And so, rather than focusing narrowly on specifically the targets of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, they were, heavily integrated into the broad left milieu, pushing abolition, pushing anti-fascism, all kinds of militant struggles, because they saw those as central to the process by which the movement would force a reckoning with the U.S.'s support for Zionism. Now, I started with the Bowman affair, but what we've seen since then is that this dynamic has actually played out many times. It's played out in respect to criticisms of any number of Democratic politicians who have expressed sympathy with Palestine. I have an article dissecting these exact same dynamics around the BDS Boston mapping project controversy. And altogether, these controversies have produced a real practical organizational split within the movement. Now, my home is on the Jewish left, and I want to speak to a particular dynamic surrounding that, because this difference in strategy has also produced really different orientations on the Jewish section of the Palestine movement. The militant strategy for ending U.S. support for Zionism sort of lends itself to a militant rejection of the media's privileging of Jewish voices and perspectives on the situation in Palestine, but the reformist strategy does not. It's actually very useful when you're trying to get elected officials to sign on to BDS or to criticize Israel, to have a prominent Jewish presence setting the talking points, setting the tone of the overall political conversation. And so they've been more willing to allow Jewish organizations to use the increased access that they, the privilege that they have, essentially, right? The increased access to media coverage and to resources, in order to sort of have allowed Jewish groups to a greater extent to play, in particular JVP, to play a spokesperson role for the movement. And in the midst of this organizational split, we also saw the founding of If Not Now, which won a hearing among young Jews for whom JVP's longstanding rejection of what I would characterize as a rejection of the need to mount a serious challenge to structural anti-Semitism. This argument wasn't working for young Jews, and that's where If Not Now found its constituency. But If Not Now was also built out of a political tradition and a strategic orientation, which intentionally turned away from hard political and theoretical questions like the question of Zionism. What this meant is that very quickly, If Not Now had degenerated into a liberal Zionist organization, which was doing pro-Palestine work. I think that this strategic split on, in the broad movement and these different relationships to the Jewish left are really key dynamics for understanding the positions that are coming out of the movement right now and sort of the overall contradictory political character that it's taken on. For anti-fascists, abolitionists, and other militants whose interactions with Palestine work had been with the Palestinian radicals orienting on them, the political level of the response to October 7th was actually quite high. But in terms of who holds the keys to the media and the politicians and who could credibly articulate a concrete demand for the movement to rally around, the guiding political ethos was political unity at the least common denominator. And I think that relates back to that strategic split. Reformist forces in the movement have been happy to accept, if not now self-imposed, political leadership over the movement, or maybe not so happy, but have been maneuvered into doing so. And the political lead coming from some of the most powerful actions has therefore been quite weak. The social chauvinism, Islamophobia, and latent acceptance of settler colonialism that make up the terms of the political culture to which electoralists are forced to accommodate also has come out in full force since October 7th. We've seen just like really bad Islamophobic narratives of Hamas dating to the Second Intifada and the War on Terror, just recycled, not just in the capitalist media, but also on the far left. And I'm not saying that, any particular force in the Palestine movement agrees with all of these dynamics, but without a consistent militant rejection of such slippages, they've become quite powerful. So that's the weaknesses of, I think, the reformists' response to this moment. And on the revolutionary side, I think we're suffering from all the same problems that we face in every movement. We're bad organizers. We lack the infrastructures with which to train new layers of militants, and even where we have them, our training prioritizes ideological clarity over technical skill. And so I've been a part of a lot of demonstrations that have lacked some basic know-how, some basic training, and I think a big piece of this is that many folks on the revolutionary left have taken the wrong lessons from the 2020 rebellions to the point where basic street-level militancy is now viewed as irresponsible, unsafe, and a sign of racial privilege, rather than a needed step in the escalation of class conflict. And for all these reasons, appreciate that, Ben. For all these reasons, the revolutionary wing has proven to simply lack the capacity for pushing back against some of the more brazenly co-opting aspects of the movement. So I've gotten kind of into the weeds here in this last section of the talk. I think that's important. Like I said, I think these dynamics are it's a really complicated situation with lots of pulls going in all kinds of directions. And I'm going to end with some sort of calls that I think are the next steps for the socialist movement in responding to this moment. But I want to put a disclaimer on this, that I'm still very much in a process of debate and discussion with comrades in this movement all over the country and internationally. I think so. I'm going to put out some of my thoughts, but I hope that folks will really take up these questions in the discussion. So with that out of the way, I have three things that I would advocate. I think the first is we need to educate ourselves. I came up politically in an ISO branch that was very oriented on Palestine work, but I think that a lot of people coming into the socialist movement lack just some basic history, basic political analysis of the situation in Palestine. And one of the things that that's meant is that we actually, apart from the general lack of democratic spaces to debate and discuss strategy on the left, particularly in this movement, I think people haven't been exposed to the questions that they're supposed to be asking. So I think we need to educate ourselves. And I think one just brief recommendation that I'll put out is that Brian Bean and Sumaya Awad's Palestine, a Socialist Introduction is a really important book. I think people should read it. I think people should read it collectively. There's just so much. That book is a great example of a text which is raising the specific questions that we need to be figuring out right now. And I think if we answered those questions, we would be a lot further in terms of actually laying out a strategy for this movement. The second thing that I'll say is that we need to, as we're educating ourselves, we also need to recognize that the role which is required from socialists in this movement, in the movement right now, is not political leadership, but capacity and training. Now, I expect this to be a slightly spicy suggestion, but I think this movement, unlike, frankly, most movements, already has a socialist vanguard. And we should celebrate that, right? The socialists are leading in many of the organizations that I've named as sort of the radical wing: the Palestinian Youth Movement, the National Students for Justice in Palestine, within our lifetimes, the Palestine Solidarity Working Group, full of socialists. And we should join these organizations. I think we should join them humbly and contribute everything that we have to give to them, because our only hope at seeing revolutionary arguments win the debates over movement strategy is seeing these forces, with all the relationships and infrastructure that they've built, strengthened. So I think we need to invest resources and really embed ourselves in these movements. And then the final thing that I say, and this is sort of the big picture $1,000,000 question for the socialist movement, but I think we need a socialist culture which embodies the tradition of the movements which created the last sort of revolutionary rehearsal in the United States. I'm thinking Black Power, the American Indian movement, queer liberation movement, the Puerto Rican national movement. We need a socialism which sees our class's many confrontations with state power not as more or less deviationist offshoots of the sort of one true class struggle, but the exact opposite. One which sees these movements and rebellions as precisely the concrete process of class struggle in action. And I think this is a very easy thing to sign on to, and a very hard thing to actually concretely do. And I would suggest with some humility that I don't think any of our organizations have actually achieved this yet. But when we're thinking about the sort of big picture tasks of the socialist movement in this country, I think this is where we need to be thinking: building political containers that can really house and embody this radical, abolitionist, anti-colonial socialist tradition.